ignore any licensing requirements. We will class any more than 3 unrelated tenants in a property sharing facilities. We will class that as being a HMO for lending purposes going forward. So our definitions there, obviously you've got different definitions in terms of what's licensing requirements, etc.
It can get quite complex, but at a basic level, under the Housing Act 2004, it's a property that's let to 3 or more sharers with 2 or more families involved. Usually they share some accommodation as well, whether that's the communal areas, the kitchen or the bathroom. The second part of the question is about a property that's been converted into units which have not complied with the minimum requirements of the 1991 building regulations and still do not. So that is a property that could be flatlets, it could be individual units which are separately saleable but do not meet those minimum standards. And if the property is a HMO by definition, the management regulations apply. There's no paperwork to confirm that. They're general obligations at law, which our experienced landlords will be familiar with at a property level in terms of all the adaptations that are required and the standards that are required to manage HMO properties.
Now, generally, you tend to find that mandatory licensing requirements are fairly standard across the country, but what does catch some people out is areas where we've got additional licensing requirements, where effectively you could have a 3-bed HMO that does need a HMO licence, and that's something that sometimes catches people out. Ultimately, this will all come out in the wash underwriting at legal stage as well. So just to ask those questions, get the client, if they're not 100% sure, just to go away and double check or local HMO licensing department as early on as they can, because that will save a lot of heartache in the long run. Whilst the HMO licence is important, you could argue that the planning is equally as important, if not more important, certainly when it comes to mortgage lending. Now, the one thing I'd always say to brokers is, yeah, by all means check that there's a HMO licence in place, get the landlord check in there, but more so is to check that they've got the relevant planning permission for that property to be used in its current format. Because if they haven't, then invariably you tend to find that lenders won't accept indemnity insurance policies to cover this, so there will need to be something put in place pre-completion. And invariably this tends to be flagged by solicitors fairly late on in the transaction. So my advice to any brokers is, yes, ask the questions regarding the HMO licence, but also really enforce how important it is that the client has got that relevant planning. Even on a remortgage property where a client may have owned this for 5-6 years, the relevant planning permission will still need to be in place.
When we're assessing the property, from a surveyor's point of view, we're looking to see that the necessary consents are in place. So let's separate the licensing side of things from the planning, which are separate considerations. From a licensing point of view, mandatory licensing kicks in at 5 or more sharers and is fairly black and white in terms of the application. From a planning point of view, when a property moves from a house to a HMO, shared property, it moves from a C3 to a C4 planning consent of up to and including 6 sharers, which is permitted within the planning framework unless there's an Article 4 direction order in place. Larger properties need a sui generis planning consent, and it's important that either way, whichever scenario it fits into, that the necessary paperwork is available to confirm that that property, as it is operated on the ground, has the necessary consents in place. When we're looking at the properties, to have the necessary consents in place, it's important that people know the local areas and have researched the local authority requirements, because the Article 4 direction orders are in place by local authority decisions. They're implemented at a local level, so it's about knowing when they're in place. If it is in place, it means planning consent is required to move from a house to a small HMO, so you C3 to C4 planning use, and those are usually in place where you do need the planning consent to control the local land uses, which is the justification that the local authorities put in place as per their considerations as part of the planning process.
Look, if you're an advisor and you're placing a HMO with any lender and you know it's an area of Article 4 is, first of all, try and establish with the client when Article 4 was implemented, and then second of all, try and establish when they started letting that property out as a HMO. If that was before Article 4 was implemented, brilliant. What can they then get to evidence that that property was used as a HMO prior to that? Is it an AST agreement? It's a copy of a council tax showing there was multiple people residing in the property? Anything like that, you tend to find that Paragon and many other lenders will take a view on it. Now, if you're unable to get that, obviously GDPR comes into this. If it was 4 or 5 years ago, you wouldn't expect landlords to have access to those types of agreements. So if you can't get anything like that, then again, speaking to local authority, the local authority able to confirm anything even via an email saying that we can confirm this property was used as a HMO prior to Article 4 being implemented. We've had one example where we found a historic Rightmove listing that showed that the property was being advertised as a HMO, existing let, but there was a couple of rooms that the landlord was still looking at letting. Again, you'll tend to find that lenders will try and find a way to accept that. However, if you've explored all those avenues and you're unable to get hold of anything, again, it's far from being the end of the world, but you're looking at things like certificate of lawful use, which for maybe 5 weeks to put in place, the cost isn't normally prohibitive, but time is of the essence. So my advice is to check when Article 4 was implemented, check when the landlord started using the property as a HMO and what they've got to evidence it. If they can't, then they should, in my advice, get their legal advisors to start the ball rolling regarding certificate of lawful use as early on in the transaction as they can.